Welcome back to the podcast. I am super excited to be here today. I am Audrey Rindlisbacher. I'm a podcaster, author, and curriculum writer focused entirely on how the truth can make us free. We do that through discovering natural laws, true principles, and truths that we can apply to our lives to put our lives in better order with God's way of living and increase our faith and find increased liberty. Today, I want to talk to you about how my husband and I were able to overcome a very broken, painful, debilitated marriage. And it started years ago. I don't even know, maybe 10 years ago. I can't remember exactly. I was speaking at a conference and I had multiple presentations that day. And then I had a table set up. And so I was standing at the table immediately after one of my presentations, and a woman came up to me and she told me that she had come to the conference with a friend of hers, and her friend had gone to one of my early presentations and then asked her to come to another presentation. And through watching what I talked about what we do on this podcast, talking about truth and principles and all that kind of stuff. She was part of a homeschooling community in Arizona, and she wanted me to come out and do a workshop for her community. She said that she could help bring me out and pay expenses and all that kind of thing. And would I be interested in doing something like that? And I said, sure, I'd be interested in figuring out if we can make that work. After this, we got on a bunch of phone calls talking about the logistics of exactly what was going to be covered and when I was going to come and all that kind of thing. And we'd been on the phone multiple times over several months. And the conference was coming up. It was coming up soon. On this one particular phone call, we had been talking about more specifics of when I was going to come and how it was going to work. And near the end of the conversation, she totally shifted the subject matter to something totally unconnected and so personal and vulnerable. I was just absolutely shocked. She started to talk to me about how her husband had been a pornography addict and how he had been able to overcome his addiction, and they had been able to find peace in their marriage. I remember that moment. I remember the room I was in. I was sitting on the floor because it was so, on the one hand, so odd that she would bring that up. We were just basically business associates. I mean, we had never met besides this one time at the conference. I didn't know her at all. We knew very little about each other, and she's just randomly bringing this up. And of course, on the other end, I'm absolutely shocked because this has been the major pain point in my marriage from the time that we got married. And there had been times in our marriage where it wasn't just looking at pornography, it was other related behaviors. And so in the back of my mind, I'm thinking, is she feeling like inspired? Is this like an answer to our prayers? Like, what's going on here? Why would she bring this up? Like, I really genuinely am not, I don't know what to think. And so she tells me all about how her husband found this support group and he'd learned the 12 steps. I mean, I'd heard of Alcoholics Anonymous. I knew almost nothing about it. I guess I'd heard of the 12 steps. I really didn't know much about them. And so she's kind of describing this to me, how he had this sponsor and he had been sober for a few years, how grateful they were, and all of these things. And again, I really didn't know what to think. I was really shocked and surprised, but also I had only ever told one other person about this, and that was my mom. And it was because we got a few years into our marriage and I was so lonely and I was so overwhelmed and I'm unable to know how to cope with this situation that I asked my husband, like, is there someone in our lives you wouldn't mind me talking to about this? And he's like, well, you could talk to your mom. So it was something that I didn't talk to anybody about. We just kind of searched for answers. We had been to lots of different support groups. We had been to marriage therapy. We'd read a lot of books. What else have we tried? We tried, I don't know, he'd gone to individual therapy. We tried all these things. And I don't know, I guess it had gotten a little bit better, but not really, because the problem was that he was really embarrassed that he couldn't control himself in this way, and that he kept it a secret and he always was sneaking, and he felt a lot of blame, a lot of personal shame, a lot of disappointment in himself. And of course, I felt a lot of confusion, overwhelm, and betrayal. And so that was just not a good mix for us. I had learned enough to kind of know maybe I shouldn't take it quite so personally. It wasn't about like that I wasn't attractive or he wasn't attracted to me or whatever, but like that was like small comfort when I would continually be like have the wind knocked out of my sails. As I would find out he'd done something again and he'd done something again, and then he'd go a longer period of time and then something would happen, or I would think that we were good for like a long period of time and then I would just be blindsided again. And so, I'm married to this man. He's lying to me. He's doing things behind my back. Just so painful. But I knew that he was trying. I knew that he didn't want to do it. I knew that he felt ashamed of it. And I also knew that he wasn't dangerous. We were safe. I was safe. He loved me very much. He treated me very good otherwise. He was a good provider, a good dad. I'd had soul searching moments about, what am I going to do here? Am I just going to continue to live with an addict? And I kind of settled into that emotionally, like, I'm going to be betrayed, but I know enough about divorce to know that the grass is usually not greener. It's usually far more complicated. Divorce rates in second and third marriages are even higher than first marriages. And I did love him, and we had so many things in common, and we really enjoyed each other's company. And so it just like, why didn't I just leave? Well, because there were all these good things, and because I knew how hard he was trying. And so, but I wasn't going to talk about it. I wasn't going to tell this woman about it. And so I just told her I was really happy for her. This is kind of how I left it. Like, that's great. Good for you. And then we get off the phone. And for the next few weeks between that phone call and the time that I went out there, I thought a lot about it. And, I was prayerful about it. I didn't know what to do. I kind of just hoped that she wouldn't bring it up again. I guess I debated whether or not I should bring it up with her and find out about this thing that they were doing, but I hadn't kind of resolved in my own mind how I was going to handle it. So I didn't have any kind of a plan. So I fly out there. She picks me up at the airport. We're driving in the car back to her house. It's just small talk, whatever. I mean, we're like really meeting kind of for the first time. And we're not even very long into the drive. And she starts right back into it. I'm just like, what is going on? And to be honest with you, I did not really know. I don't really remember what she was talking about because I was really distracted with my own inner dialogue. So she starts talking to me about it again, and I start having this overwhelming feeling that I should tell her about Blaine. And I don't want to. I feel like that would be unfair to him. It would be kind of like, maybe not a betrayal, but like I hadn't talked to him about it beforehand. I hadn't told other people. I just didn't really know what to do. And so she's talking about whatever she's talking about. I don't know, maybe telling me about her husband or about their circumstances. I don't know. And I'm just like, what should I do? What should I do? What should I do? And so finally I just like said a prayer in my heart, like what would be the best thing to do here? And I just continued to feel like I should tell her. And so I just thought, well, Blaine knows that I try to be a godly woman and that I try to be prayerful in my decisions. And so I guess I'll just go ahead and tell her, and then I'll just let him know that I've told her and why I told her. So I was like, well, actually, it's kind of been a problem. And actually, it's been a problem since he was a little boy. And actually, we've tried everything and we don't know what to do. But I think it's a lot better now. I don't think it's all that bad. And I really meant that because, of course, like I said, we would go through these bouts of like, it was better for a while. And so I would just tell myself, maybe it's over, maybe it's not a big thing. And so she started asking me all these questions, which I largely didn't have the answers to until finally she was like, okay, well, that's great that you guys are in a better place, whatever. If I can help, let me know. But I just hope that he's not white knuckling it. And that phrase really, really stayed with me because I later came to see that actually he was. So we do the thing, we do this 2-day seminar, whatever, it's good. And we don't talk about it again. We're with her family, we're with these people. So we go to the airport and she's got one of her kids in the car. And so we get there and she wants to hug me bye. So she gets out of the car and then she kind of pulls me around the corner. And I realize after the fact, it's because she wants me to give me the Alcoholics Anonymous book. She doesn't want her child to see. And so she hugs me goodbye and she hands me this book and she just says, I just want you to have this. I just hope it can be as big a blessing to you as it has been to us. And, thank you for coming. Bye-bye. I'll tell you, it didn't just help us, it revolutionized our lives, it saved our marriage. So I want to tell you some of the backstory of this book so that you can have a frame of reference for other people who have saved their marriages through the principles that are taught in Alcoholics Anonymous and why that is the case. And then we're going to talk about why that is the case. So Bill Wilson was born in 1895 in Vermont. And shortly after he was born, his parents abandoned him and his sister. So he was raised by his maternal grandparents. And that abandonment was hard on him, and his teenage years were really troubled. But he was able to get it together and go to college. But when he was in college, he had so much depression and so many anxiety attacks that he had to take a break. And about the time that he came back home, he was working, he met Lois. And Lois was the daughter of a wealthy surgeon. She was already a college graduate with a career, and she was 4 years older than him. So they seemed like a really odd match, but they fell in love and they courted for a couple of years, and then they ended up marrying. Now, while they were engaged, Bill had alcohol for the first time. And it was like he was immediately hooked because he'd always struggled with his self-confidence and he'd always been awkward and shy. And as soon as he took a drink, he realized that it loosened him up and he felt more comfortable. And so he said that he had found the elixir of life. And he began to drink more and more often. And sometimes he would drink until he passed out. So then the war came and he was deployed. He had been drinking more. And while he was, off in the war, he drank even more. When he came back, he started out by pursuing law, but then decided to play in the stock market. And he began investing. And he said, the drive for success was on. I'd prove to the world that I was important. So this chronic feeling of insignificance that led him to try to lean into drinking had gotten him hooked. And he was now definitely an addict. And so after he was dabbling in the stock market, they decided to quit their jobs and take to the road, and they were going to follow this crazy business idea that he had. So they went around the country following this idea. They lived like Spartans. They invested all their money, and it totally paid off. They had a windfall. And he said, for the next few years, fortune threw money and applause my way. I had arrived. It was the roaring 20s. He amassed a fortune. They had, everything pretty much you could want. But then his drinking became more and more frequent. So eventually, his drinking starts to threaten his career and threaten their wealth and threaten their marriage. And Lois started begging him to stop. She could see that it was really beginning to destroy him and erode his ability to function normally in the world. On several occasions, he swore on the Bible and made covenants with God and with Lois, and he would write his commitment in their family Bible and swear on it. And he was never able to keep these pledges of sobriety. He said, my drinking assumed more serious proportions, continuing all day and almost every night. So then, of course, in October 29, the stock market crashes and his wealth is basically wiped out almost overnight. They lose everything. They move in with Lois's parents and she goes to work. And for the next 5 years, she works full time to provide for them. Now, she was not able to have children, so they don't have any children at this point. So basically, her husband's a drunkard and she's providing for him while they're just dead broke. And she can't always make enough money because work is scarce. And so they're selling off many of their assets in order to provide during this time. And Bill said, liquor ceased to be a luxury, it became a necessity. I began to waken very early in the morning, shaking violently. Nevertheless, I still thought I could control the situation, and there were periods of sobriety which renewed my wife's hopes. Yet he was unable to follow through on his resolves, and he started to think, well, I must be crazy. He said the remorse, horror, and hopelessness were unforgettable. The courage to do battle was there. I cursed myself for a weakling. And my husband and I could totally relate to this, because while there were times when it got bad, it just got bad. And he didn't have like out and out multiple, like involved affairs and things like that. But he could never stop. He would, you know, like my friend said, he would white knuckle it for a while. He would work really hard, and then he would just betray himself. He would betray his resolve. He couldn't not use pornography and sexual behaviors to manage his emotions. And then he would lie to me about it, and he would hide it from me, and then I would feel betrayed again. And it was just so painful. I mean, I just can't even tell you the number of times. I never had the kind of quite as desperate situation as Lois and Bill did, but I can really relate to the despair, the hopelessness, just the feeling of this is never going to change. We're never going to be able to fix this. So by this time, Bill is 40 pounds underweight and he's ill. And he's admitted to a rehabilitation hospital, and he became sober and well. There was a doctor there who educated him on the nature of alcoholism. So he gets released from the hospital, and he has a few months of sobriety, and he's elated. He's like, oh, this is it. I've arrived. And all I needed was self-knowledge. I just had to understand how alcoholism worked, and I would be able to stay sober. Well, eventually he drank again. And then he drank and drank and drank, and he became hospitalized again. And at this point, they didn't know if he was going to live. Like, his life was in danger at this point. He said, no words can tell of the loneliness and despair I found in that bitter morass of self-pity. Alcohol was my master. Then came the visit that changed his life. A childhood friend and fellow alcoholic came to visit. He had been on the edge of collapse. He was going to be put in prison, but some people, two men came and persuaded the judge to postpone putting him in prison based on their willingness to work with him and try to get him sober. They had a program that they said would work for him, and he went through the program and it worked. Here he was, however long after, I don't know how many months or years it had been, and he was sober, and he came to Bill's hospital room, and he shared in Bill's greatest time of need, he shared these tools, these principles. Well, at first Bill was angry and rejected it, and then he came to see, this friend has something I don't have, and he has a light in his eyes, and he is sober. And Bill was really skeptical. He's like, what's happened to you? And his friend said, I've got religion. Now, both of these men had some conception of God. I mean, Bill was swearing on the Bible. Like, he kind of believed in God, but he had tried everything, and he just didn't believe that it could work. He did have a profound spiritual experience in the hospital, living these laws. He gave his life over to God, like the first 2 or 3 principles of the steps of AA tell you to. And he had a profound experience there. But he also gained a new understanding of how to utilize God's aid. What was he doing wrong? Because I will tell you, and I totally relate to this. Maybe you do too. You're completely stuck in your life, and you can't figure out why you can't move forward. And there's a God, and you love him. And maybe you consider yourself a very obedient person. Maybe you're a religious person. Maybe you pray. Maybe you study scripture. Maybe you attend church services. Maybe you try to do good things in your community, but you can't figure out why you can't get unstuck in this area. And I'm here to tell you that in every case, pretty much, now sometimes suffering is part of God's plan for us, and sometimes we just need to suffer through something, but often it's the case, more often than not, in my experience, that there are truths that we don't know, we don't see, we're not living in harmony with. And those are all part of God's natural law. The laws of health, the laws of relationships, the laws of business. And as long as you don't understand and align with those, you will continue to suffer. And so we didn't understand the principles of addiction recovery. We didn't understand some of the relationship principles we needed to live. And the Alcoholics Anonymous book had these answers. So Bill saw the change in his friend, and Bill said, I made the point blank declaration. His friend made the point blank declaration that God had done for him what he could not do for himself. And my ideas about miracles were drastically revised right then. So he chose a conception of God that he felt comfortable with. And he said, upon a foundation of complete willingness, he turned his life over to God that I might build what I saw in my friend, that he might have with that the miracle might happen for him that it happened for his friend. So I'm back at home. I'm reading this book. I'm in tears because I'm reading Bill's story and I'm absolutely floored that he hit bottom in such a profound way. And he had lifelong sobriety after this. He helped hundreds, eventually tens of thousands, and now it's in the multi-millions around the world, people to gain permanent sobriety through these principles that he taught, these 12 steps. And it began with this willingness concept. I talk about this in my academies, Mission Driven Teen and Mission Driven Mom Academies, and in my book, The Mission Driven Life, because willingness is the first step. It's like the Beatitude, blessed are the poor in spirit. Until you know you need help and you throw your arms up in the air and you say, I am stuck, I'm willing to do anything, God can't work with you. So he said, I humbly offered myself to God as I then understood him, to do with me as he would. I placed myself unreservedly under his care and direction. I admitted for the first time that of myself I was nothing, that without him I was lost. I ruthlessly faced my sins and became willing to have my newfound friend, God, take them away, root and branch. I have not had a drink since. So not only did I long for the results that Bill was talking about for us, I kept reading. And as I kept reading, Bill starts talking about the root reason that people are addicted. So he goes into step 4. So first of all, I'm thinking, okay, I really think that God brought us this book, and I really think this has something for us. But 2 incredible miracles happened. The first one was when I was reading step 4, and this is what it says. Next, we launched out on a course of vigorous action, the first step of which is a personal house cleaning, which many of us had never attempted. We started upon a personal inventory. We took stock honestly. First, we searched out the flaws of our makeup, which caused our failure. And then it hit me that a few weeks prior to my going to this event and receiving this book and coming home, and now I'm reading it, my husband had come to me and had told me that he felt that he should make a list, that he should take inventory or take stock honestly of the flaws of his makeup, that he should write down a list of the things that his conscience disapproved of that were a blight on his character. He knew he would not be able to remember all of the things that he had done wrong in his life, but he rose early every morning and he took time alone in prayer and asked to be given those things that he should add to the list. I was just shocked and so grateful, so full of gratitude that God saw us, that it was clear to me at that point that God had been leading him down these steps, that these principles were absolutely true and divinely inspired and part of God's natural laws. because without any of this information, he had given my husband the same tools and asked him to go through this process. So then I bring my husband in and I'm telling him all of this and I'm sharing this with him. And then he tells me something else he hadn't told me before. And that is that a few months prior, he had sat down to really evaluate himself in his life. And when he got really honest, he realized that he was still acting out regularly and that he wanted to be done forever. This is a lifelong plague. He felt that it was out of his control and he didn't want to live this way any longer. And so for over 3 months, he had been spending 20, 30 or more minutes every single day in heartfelt prayer, talking to God about this addiction and asking to be released from it. And getting himself to a point where he was absolutely willing, as Bill was, to hand his life over to God and to do whatever was necessary to be free. And that was the second miracle. So with all of that background, we knew this was God providing the next steps. This was absolutely, Blaine had shown his willingness. He had committed himself. God had shown him the first few steps that he needed to be willing to do what was ever necessary and that he needed to write down this list and take inventory. And he was ready for the next steps, which God had provided in this book. It's absolutely unbelievable. So then we're going along through these next steps. And right after step 4, as he gets into step 5, Bill starts talking about this. He calls it the number one offender. He says, this is the thing that gets people addicted and keeps them addicted. It's the same thing that all addicts have in common. It's a behavior. It's a way of managing life. It's a dysfunctional, broken, emotional, mental tool, even spiritual, quote, tool, attitude, way of being that causes people to become addicted and to stay addicted. This is what he says. Resentment is the number one offender. It destroys more alcoholics than anything else. From it stem all forms of spiritual disease, for we have been not only mentally and physically ill, we have been spiritually sick. When the spiritual malady is overcome, we straighten out mentally and physically. So as we started to learn about resentment, we just had no idea that it was killing us. It was keeping our marriage stuck. It was keeping me spiritually and emotionally stuck. It was keeping Blaine addicted. It was the cancer that was eating our marriage. Now, I want to spend a few minutes with you talking about why this is the case, how we got out from under resentment to heal our marriage, and why resentment is the number one killer so much of the time. It kills us, it keeps us stuck, it damns us. And there's a specific, very, very important reason why it damns us. I'll talk to you about it in just a minute. But we get stuck in these areas of our lives and we get resentful. We get proud. We don't want to have to change. We want the problem to be out there. So we act like a victim. We fall into self-pity. We act selfish. We're dishonest with ourselves. We're sometimes dishonest with other people. We have this really broken pattern of behavior. And that's why in my academies, especially in level 1, it's a deep dive into all this stuff. You know, what do we do to get out of being a victim? And what is this self-pity and self-deception trap that we fall into? And how do we get out of those? But for right now, I want to talk to you about why this was happening to us, why we were stuck, and what this process looks like. Now, just to let you know, I've got another podcast about forgiveness that goes into some tools. I have 5 or 6 or 7 tools for forgiving that I really want you to spend time in. And if you get into any of the academies, we'll do an even deeper dive there. I've got some other podcasts on addiction And I'm going to be putting out another podcast soon of my husband and I talking about some other addiction tools. So all of this stuff about addiction and resentment and all of that stuff, I've got other tools and other information for you. And if you want an even deeper dive and more practice and access to talk to me in the community, then you can join the Mission of Mom Academy. But in the meantime, I want to help you understand how this process works, how we get ourselves so stuck. So what happens is an injustice is committed. We all have a sense of the moral law, this natural law that weighs on our hearts, that's written on our hearts by God. And we know what justice is and we know what injustice is. And someone treats us wrongly, or we treat ourselves wrongly. We make a commitment to ourselves and we don't follow through. So there's an injustice. And anger is the natural, proper response to injustice. Now, we know that anger is not wrong in and of itself because God gets angry. He gets angry when people sin, when they're unjust, when they make commitments, when they go against the natural law, when they don't live according to what they know is right. He gets mad. And anger is fine. It's a moral quality. We are angry because we're making a moral judgment. We are saying there is a right and there is a wrong, and a wrong was committed, and we're mad about it. And that's actually a good thing. If we didn't get mad about it, we wouldn't be moved to action. So the anger can be helpful, okay? So when we're mistreated or we're not given proper respect, we're angry and we feel justified because of the misbehavior. Resentment, on the other hand, involves re-feeling the original anger. We remember the injury and re-feel the emotion surrounding the hurt. Anger is like a flame and resentment is like a hot coal. So when we resent, we're nursing the anger. We're dwelling on it. And self-pity is the behavior we engage in to fan the flame into a fire. There are 5 behaviors, broken behaviors that we engage in addiction that cause us to be addicted to anything, to food, to anything. And there are antidotes to all of those triggers. God never does any of these 5 things. We do all of them or some of them, and every time we do them, we're hurting ourselves and hurting other people. We're engaging in they're wrong patterns of behavior, wrong ways of handling the anger from the injustices of the world. So we control what we do with anger and we engage in self-pity, and this anger turns into resentment that sinks deep into our soul and begins to canker it. And what we wind up with is a sustained anger that's always burning. That's why resentment really only hurts me. I mean, it hurts the people around me too because I take it out on them, but it hurts me most because I've taken an injustice and I've turned it inward. I've turned it into something that's that coal that's burning inside me all the time. And it begins to canker my soul. And it can flare up at any time. It's controlling my emotions and many situations. So my past is now controlling my present and dictating my future in a way that's incredibly unhealthy. And rather than choosing to move forward in our lives, and forgiveness is the way forward. So I want to read you this. You've heard it before, probably. This is a parable Jesus gave. He says, the kingdom of heaven is like a certain king, which was taking account of his servants. And when he began to reckon, he brought one to him. This is in Matthew 18. He owed him 10,000 talents. I mean, I looked this up once. It's like, I don't know, hundreds of millions of dollars. It's like such an astronomical amount of money. And he couldn't pay. So the Lord commanded him that he was going to be sold and his wife and children were going to be sold and everything he had was going to be sold to start making the payment. And the servant falls to the ground and he worships him and he says, Lord, have patience and I will pay thee all. I mean, this is such a huge amount of money. To be quite honest, the Lord probably knew he was probably never going to be able to repay it. But he's so humble and he's so willing. And he's so penitent that the Lord shows mercy on him. So the Lord is moved with compassion and forgives the debt. He didn't just forgive the man. He didn't just say, it's okay, you can start paying me back. He says, I'm wiping it out. It's as if you don't owe me anything. So then that same servant goes out and found one of his fellow servants that owed him 100 pence, which is just a piddly amount of money. And he laid hands on him and took him by the throat. So he's like really laying into this guy and says, pay me what you owe me. He's demanding, I mean, he's getting violent with this guy. And the servant does exactly the same thing he did. He falls down at his feet and he begs him, have patience with me and I'll pay you all. But he would not. And he cast him into prison until the debt was paid. So when his fellow servants, so the people around him, saw what he had done, he knew that the Lord had forgiven him, and he saw what he had done to this other servant. They were very sorry, and they came and told their Lord what was done. And the Lord, after he called him to him, said, oh, you wicked servant, I forgave you all the debt because you begged that of me. Shouldn't you have also had compassion on your fellow servant, even as I had pity on you? And the Lord was wroth and delivered him to the tormentors till he should pay what was due. So we have had grace extended to us. We have been promised that we will be forgiven when we ask for forgiveness. And our refusal to forgive is resentment. That resentment is simply our playing God. It's our flaw. It's something that we are doing, not something that someone else is doing. The other person, or even ourselves, committed an injustice, but the resentment is a choice that we're making every day to see ourselves and the world with distorted glasses. We're elevating ourselves and we're debasing others, or we're debasing ourselves beyond all redemption, which is also sinful because we've been told that we can and will be forgiven. So it damns your progress. This is something that you're doing and you're refusing to take responsibility for your part in the problem. You're injuring yourself. Resentment is the way forward. Resentment is how we let go of the past and we stop being in this destructive behavior of resentment, and we stop acting on these 5 bad behaviors, and we start forgiving. Now, I could tell you a lot of amazing stories about forgiveness. Left to Tell is one of the most powerful stories I've ever read on forgiveness. We tackle that one in the academy. But if she can forgive, you can forgive. I can forgive. Anyone can forgive. And forgiveness is a choice. He spends time with incest victims. And every single one of them that goes through this process over a year period of time is able to forgive. They overcome their depression and they can move on with their lives. It is the way forward. And so it was doing me no good to hang on to the past, to keep using that as a whip to abuse my husband, right? And myself, to keep conjuring up all these ways that we had done things wrong, and to keep, bringing to the forefront of both of our minds, behaviors that he had done in the past. It wasn't helping anybody. It was keeping us both stuck. So what is forgiveness then? This is really fascinating. I want you to really listen to this. If you don't hear anything else on this particular podcast, I want you to really hear this, because when I understood the true definition of forgiveness, a lot of things started to change. It comes from the Latin remitto, which means to send back, throw back, or relax. So here's what remit means. Forgiveness is remitting, sending it back. But here's what remitting is. If you remit something, this is what you do. To send something such as a dispute or a court case, so this injustice, you send it to an authority that can make a decision about it. So forgiveness is a choice to let God be the judge and execute justice. That doesn't mean that you let them off the hook. It doesn't mean you don't turn them into the cops. It doesn't mean you aren't honest with the people around you about what this person has done. It doesn't mean you hide their sins. It doesn't mean that you bond with them and you're close and you're best friends from now on. It doesn't mean any of those things. It just means that you recognize that you don't know everything, and you don't know this person's heart, and you don't know their intention, and you don't know why they're doing what they're doing, and it's not your place to make a judgment about them. It's not your place to condemn them. You need to make judgments about their behavior in terms of your relationship with them, how much time you're going to spend with them, whether or not, what you're going to do in the future. But you're remitting it. You're handing it over. You're saying, God, you're the authority that can make a decision about this, not me. Now, because it's a judgment, forgiveness is a moral action. Moral actions are actions that we choose through the power of our will to do the thing that we don't want to do, but that we feel we ought to do. And sometimes we don't even always know we ought to necessarily, because they feel counterintuitive. Forgiveness is one of those things that feels counterintuitive. You hear people all the time, someone in their family was murdered, whatever, like, I will never forgive them. They don't deserve forgiveness. But that's because I'm not letting them off the hook. I'm going to try to see to it that they're off the streets. Like, doesn't have anything to do with forgiveness. It's not what we naturally want to do, but it's what, as a spiritual person, we ought to do. It's the right thing to do, but we resist it. It feels like the harder path. It feels like it requires more work. We resist out of fear, of pain, of work, of failure, of ignorance, but it has the best fruits. The outcomes are relief, a clear conscience, inner peace, decreased emotional pain, such as depression, anxiety, and others. But here's the catch, and I want to make this really clear. In almost every case, it feels like we're giving the other person the upper hand, and that will come off as weak and small. So many times we don't want to take the right moral action because inside we feel like, oh, that's going to debase me. That's going to make me small and weak. That's giving someone else the upper hand, whether it's admitting we were wrong or asking someone for forgiveness or telling someone the absolute truth. But relief is the result of doing that. And it's the same with forgiveness. It feels counterintuitive. Confession and repentance, restitution, passive resistance, servant leadership, these all feel like counterintuitive moral principles, but they're the right way. They're the moral law pressing on us, and forgiveness is that way too. So lastly, I want to spend a couple minutes with you talking about the commandment to forgive and how it becomes redemptive. So in this parable about the Lord and the servant, I want to return to it really quickly, because the whole reason that Jesus told this story was because Peter came to him and said, Lord, how oft shall my brother sin against me, and I forgive him? Till 7 times? Peter's like, wow, it just feels like a lot. 7 times is a lot. Do you want me to forgive 7 times? That would seem like that would be so much. That would be too much. And Jesus said, I don't say 7 times. I say 7 times, 70 times 7. So countless times. Pretty much, you got to keep forgiving forever. And he ends the parable with this. Remember that Lord was wroth and he delivered him to the tormentors? When we don't forgive, it feels like torment. Bill was being tormented. That resentment was causing him absolute misery. He was living in hell because he was damning himself spiritually through his unwillingness to forgive. And the parable ends with this caution. So likewise shall my heavenly Father do also unto you, if you from your hearts forgive not everyone his brother their trespasses. Jesus is giving us a very poignant warning here. If we don't forgive, we will be tormented with our own resentment, and it will turn into addictions that control us, and loss of freedom, and broken relationships, broken careers, broken lives. Now, the reason for this is because Jesus said, this is a big if we forgive men their trespasses, your heavenly Father will also forgive you. So if you forgive, you'll be forgiven. It's a conditional principle. God forgives you, wipes your slate clean, cleanses your soul on condition that you also forgive, that you strive to be like him in that very specific way. And there are tools. You don't have to be lost on how to forgive. The thing that's so rough here is that we think about forgiveness as an emotion. It's an action. We can take the actions of forgiveness. There are steps. There is a path. And when we don't forgive, we're playing God. We're telling God, I know this person so well, and I know these circumstances so well that they don't deserve to be forgiven. They don't deserve for me to let go of it. I'm going to keep blowing oxygen on that coal and keep that fire burning forever. And so if we can't, if emotions come and go, and God's commanding us he's telling us it's required of us to forgive, then either forgiveness isn't about emotions or God would have us change our emotions. So he does both. He shows us, first of all, that he makes it possible. This is what Scripture is full of. I mean, the story of Scripture is ask anything and you'll receive the answer. Anything I've commanded you, I will open a way. My grace is extended to you in all things. Take my yoke upon you. Like over and over and over again, God tells us, my grace is sufficient for you. In John, he says that he's full of grace and truth. So truth is the way, and forgiveness is a truth. We are expected, commanded to live this truth and promise that it will liberate us from the torturers. And grace is the power to follow the truth. That's why he's full of grace and truth. He's the way. He shows that truth, points the way to go, and then he gives us the power to do it. He says, if you love him, you'll keep his commandments. And forgiving is the great thing. We will receive and be able to do great things in his name. And forgiving is the great thing he's asked you to do. You cannot progress spiritually. You cannot participate in grace. You cannot grow along spiritual lines unless you forgive. It is one of the principles that Jesus brings up multiple times and is very clear on. It is a choice that you make to participate in grace and bring healing and unity and peace to the world. It is a way that you can actually, in a small way, do what God does to become more like him. Okay, now, how does this happen? It happens through the miracle of love. So in the Academy, we have a definition of love that is the extension of your will for the spiritual growth of yourself and others. So forgiveness is an action that we've been commanded to take. So it is an act of the will. It is a moral action we can choose. We want to feel good feelings towards a person. We want to love them properly. We want to wish them well. We want to be at peace in this relationship, even a relationship with ourselves. But we have to take the action first. That's why the miracle comes after the faith. The miracle of love, the miracle of release, the miracle of peace comes after the action, the choice to forgive. And I don't know how it works with God, but I know for me and for all the things I've read and studied and all the times I've chosen to forgive and all the people that I know who have forgiven, there's a pattern that the feelings of love and the feelings of peace come after the forgiveness is extended. I love others more after I forgive them. We've been commanded to love. We've been commanded to forgive. So does God always love us? Does he forgive us and then love us more? Does he have feelings towards us all the time? We know he gets mad. So he doesn't feel all touchy-feely, lovey inside when he's like calling us to repentance, right? There's anger there, but there's not resentment. That's why refusal to forgive is a spiritual cancer, and it was eroding my husband and I. It was keeping us stuck. When I exercise my will to take actions of love toward myself, when I love my enemy, forgiveness is a way that I can love my enemy. I'm commanded to, and it doesn't change them, it changes me. I need to love them by forgiving them and wishing them well, because that keeps my heart right with myself and with God. This is how I receive the feelings of love for them. I know it seems counterintuitive. With every person who honestly attempts it, it's one of the greatest evidences of God and his love for his children that forgiveness even works. That addiction would be ultimately a spiritual problem driven by resentment, and that only a spiritual solution of forgiveness can create sobriety is, to me, one of the greatest evidences of a spiritual realm and a loving God. Now, here's something we also often don't think about, that forgiveness is also a service. When we think about God, we think about one of the greatest services he does for us is to forgive us. And that's why forgiveness is not only an act of love, it's an act of service. God will give us the ability, he will walk through it with us, and feelings of peace and love will be extended to us when we choose this path. We can choose to love, and we can choose to serve by choosing to forgive. And I can't tell you how different my relationship with my husband is. It is night and day different. We are patient with each other. We are kind to each other. Our relationship is hands down better than it's ever been. He's found permanent sobriety for years. He's completely honest. He doesn't fall into the traps. He exercises the antidotes, and there's more on that in other podcasts, and there'll be more coming on that in a future podcast when I release that of him and I discussing those principles. But for now, I just want to say that I really believe forgiveness is one of the most underutilized principles in the world. There are so many couples who do not realize that if they would forgive themselves and forgive others and forgive their spouse, there would be a way forward for them. That doesn't mean that there isn't there isn't good reason for divorce. That doesn't mean that doesn't need to happen sometimes. I get it. But I also know that you don't know what can happen unless you put in the work. And you're very honest about the fact that you're just holding on to resentments. I mean, there's some incredible stats about people 10 years or more after their divorce, like 50% of them are still resentful towards their prior spouse, which shows me that they didn't forgive while in the marriage to see how healing it might have been and how they might have been able to move forward. Here's a few principles of forgiveness I want to list for you as I finish up. Forgiveness is number one, forgiveness is a powerful healing tool that rids us of anger and not only rids us of anger, but heals other deep emotional issues, depression, anxiety, and helplessness. 2, forgiveness is available for everyone, anyone, no matter the issue. It can eventually be forgiven. 3, forgiveness is a process, not an event, although it often culminates in a feeling of release and relief. 4, forgiveness is a choice in the sense that we can mentally decide we will forgive, and we can take specific actions to show our intention that we will eventually lead to a change of emotions. We can't change our emotions. God can, but we can take the actions that will lead to the emotional change. So the principle is that it's a choice. We take the action, which leads to the emotions we want to feel. 5, seeing our own mistakes and weaknesses and seeing the other person as needing healing and being ill is an important part of the process. Getting out of self-deception, as we would talk about in the academy. accepting the whole truth of the situation, that we have our own weaknesses and faults, and we need forgiveness too. 6, God's grace is inherent in this process because it is the force that propels us to action, increases our courage, does the healing, and provides hints and insights along the way. Forgiveness is the process of giving up to a proper authority what isn't ours to judge and correct. And 8, our willingness to participate in the forgiveness process, to hand it over to God, to stop playing God and submit and let him run our lives instead of playing God, accelerates the process and enables it to work. My challenge to you is to take this seriously, to really try to evaluate yourself, to be very honest about what it is that you can do. If I ask you who you need to forgive, you probably immediately know. And I'll tell you, the people closest to you are often the hardest to forgive because they're the ones that you live with day in and day out, and they keep making that same stupid mistake, and they keep having that same stupid weakness that just rubs you raw, that you just don't want to live with anymore. And sometimes forgiveness is something like in my case that I've done countless times, over and over and over and over and over and over and over again. But it can be done. And you can build a muscle. You can gain a habit. You can be able to get better at forgiving and begin to see that it is such a release for you. It provides so much increased love and peace and forward propulsion for you that you want to do it. You feel more motivated to do it. So that's my challenge today. Think about it. Listen to some of the other podcasts. If you need more help and support, you can come join the Academy. But ultimately, I'm telling you, you don't know if your marriage can be saved unless you first put in the work of truly forgiving and then seeing where your heart is at and feeling those increased feelings of love that are generated by forgiveness and seeing a way forward. I'm sure there's other principles that can be lived and need to be lived, but this is hands down maybe the most critical, maybe the most overlooked, and maybe the most healing. Thank you for joining me today. If this has been helpful for you, please pass it on to a friend, follow, give a subscribe, give a like, give a review, all of those wonderful things to help us grow this podcast. Thank you, and I'll see you next time.